Andy? Every time I sit on the toilet, I start to cry. Let me jump in here so we can start talking about finger banging Bob Lazar.
Oh, yeah. That's his nickname, finger banging Bob Lazar.
Another thing he doesn't want to talk about. Let's start with the obvious question. Who is Bob Lazar? Bob Lazar is, he's kind of the original Area 51 truther in a way, and one of the more controversial figures in the UFO community. Bob claims to have worked at a facility near Area 51 and to have worked on reverse engineering extraterrestrial technology at the facility. But starting there, Bunk Funkers, would be doing you a disservice. That would only give you a partial enchilada, and we know your hungry little mind tummies want the whole enchilada. So let's start at the beginning, and let's retell Bob Lazar's story. So Bob Lazar was born on January 26th, 1959 in Coral Gables, Florida. Bob grew up in New York, where he graduated from W. Tresper Clark High School in 1976. Bob was always a tinkerer, and he was always interested in science, and he even built a jet engine, that's right, to go on his bike. Andy, I could barely even screw on the bike horn my dad bought me. It's one of those bike horns that goes, "Auga!" Like an old-timey car. You remember those, right, Andy?
No, I sure do, Art. Gee, those old LaSalles ran great. Those were the days.
They sure were. And speaking of days, in the days after graduating high school, Bob Lazar continued his education, receiving a master's degree in physics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT. Bob put this advanced degree to use when he started working at Los Alamos National Laboratory, which was originally opened as part of the Manhattan Project and produced the nuclear weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 1982, while he worked at Los Alamos, the Alamogordo Daily News ran a cover story on Bob and his jet-powered Honda. The day after the story ran, legendary physicist and father of the H-bomb, Edward Teller, was giving a speech at Los Alamos. In the speech, Teller argued against the nuclear freeze movement happening at the time, which, aimed to get the USA and USSR to agree to stop testing, producing, deploying nuclear weapons. Before giving the lecture, though, Lazar spotted Teller outside looking at the newspaper and introduced himself as the guy with the souped-up Civic. The two chatted for a bit about frickin' sick-ass Hondas with a jet engine before Teller had to go give his stupid, dumb lecture or whatever.
Later in 1982, Bob left Los Alamos to pursue other interests, including getting a master's in electronic technology from the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech, and a move to Las Vegas until getting the itch to rejoin the scientific community later in the 80s. Bob sent resumes around to lots of different places, including several national labs. Bob even sent a resume and letter to Ed Teller, who referred him to a firm called EG&G, a defense contractor which did the hiring for certain government positions. Bob interviewed and was struck by the number of questions they asked him about his life outside of work. They asked about his jet-powered vehicles, and Bob mentioned to the interviewer that he had a particle accelerator in his bedroom. What types of particles exactly he was accelerating in his bedroom, we don't know for sure. But it may have been to make some kind of hydrogen fuel for a car. Or maybe make his penis big. Regardless, it seems like the government was looking for an outside-the-box thinker. Maybe even a rogue scientist type. Bob must have fit the bill because he got the job. He was officially employed by the Navy and was slated to work at a facility called S4, which was built into the mountainside south of Area 51 near Papoose Lake in Nevada. The first day on the job, Bob boarded a bus at EG&G and was driven to the airport, where he boarded a plane for Area 51. Once at Area 51, Bob began to discover the mysterious world of paperwork. Bob did copious amounts of paperwork. There are a lot of forms to get security clearance. Bob says that his security clearance was at a level the government refers to as majestic.
While Bob waited, he was given access to read a number of different briefings. The briefings divulged all sorts of information on human interaction with extraterrestrial beings. He saw detailed drawings of extraterrestrial anatomy. We're talking extreme detail here, if you get what I'm saying, Bunk Funkers. Extreme anatomical detail.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. They're hot.
Yeah.
He also read that the extraterrestrials come from Z3, the third planet in the Zeta Reticuli system. Now, for you Bunk Funkers who aren't astronomy junkies like me, Zeta Reticuli is a binary star system, that is, 2 stars orbiting the same point. The system is about 39 light years from Earth. Interestingly, both stars in the system are thought to be pretty similar to our sun here. So after all the paperwork was done, and after Bob got done jacking off to all those alien pictures, and the majestic clearance was granted, Bob began to work at S4. Working at a place like S4, well, safe to say, was not like your typical 9-to-5 job. Bob was called in to work at the lab at odd hours, and he wasn't even called in every single day. The way he described it, he might get a call at 11 p.m. to come in to the lab, and he'd have to go to EG&G, board a bus, take the bus to the airport, then hop on a plane to Groom Lake, where he'd then take a bus to S4. At first, Bob assumed that the secrecy and intense security was because he was working on some kind of secret military technology. Then, one day, Bob entered S4 through a hangar door. There he saw a flying saucer with an American flag on the side. Bob thought he was getting the first glimpse of the craft he was working on, an advanced military fighter that was the basis for so many flying saucers in the past. Bob was paired at S4 with a lab partner named Barry, who had been working at S4 for longer than Bob. Barry revealed to Bob their real goal: to reverse engineer a working extraterrestrial antimatter reactor, which was used to power the craft that Bob had seen in the hangar, which was one of 9 total crafts at S4. Barry showed Bob the reactor in the lab, asking Bob to put his hands on the reactor. But Bob couldn't touch the reactor. Not because he was a widow scaredy baby, but it's because his hands were repelled by force.
Look, honestly, Barry seems like a pretty cool lab partner. He fired up this reactor and dared Bob to touch it, even though Barry made it seem that his previous lab partner had died working on the reactor. That's pretty cool. Barry also led Bob to believe that S4 had brought in a whole string of different people to work on the reactor before Bob. Neither Bob nor Barry truly had any idea how long the reactor had been under study, but Barry indicated that at least one of the crafts at S4 was discovered as part of an archaeological dig. Another craft Bob saw in the hangar had physical damage from an apparent projectile, possibly being shot down and recovered by the military. Or maybe it was shot as part of some sort of test. We don't know. Bob and Barry set out to get some answers to the function of the reactor, and they felt like they came up with some pretty good ideas. Now, I'm no egghead scientist, of course, but here's what they thought. They believed the base of the reactor is a cyclotron, which is a particle accelerator that operates in a constant magnetic field. The reactor was powered by element 115, a heavy element which produces its own gravitational field and was not known on Earth at the time. Now again, I'm no scientist, but as I understand it, Bob says the reactor works by smashing protons into element 115, which produces an antiproton, which is how the craft gets its power. Bob also says that the reactor suffered no heat loss. Regardless of the load placed on it, the reactor never got warmer than the ambient temperature. Now that's an efficient engine. Since element 115 wasn't available on this planet, Bob and Barry were tasked with figuring out how the reactor worked so that they could then figure out how to make it work the same way, but fueled by something other than element 115.
Bob was able to eventually view the craft in person so that he could inspect the propulsion system that was powered by the reactor. The craft, which Bob calls the, quote, sports model, was approximately 52 feet in diameter. Inside, the craft had 3 small seats designed for creatures maybe 3 feet tall. The reactor was in the middle of the craft with the seats around it. In the lower deck, there were gravity amplifiers and gravity emitters. According to Bob, the reactor produces the gravity force through the antimatter reaction, which is then amplified and directed to the craft's desired destination. So rather than moving through space, the craft creates a distortion in the space in front of it. It kind of just enters the distortion, bringing the target to it instead of going to the target. So while it was not uncommon for crafts to be taken through test flights, both Bob and Barry both knew this test flight schedule, it was uncommon that Bob or Barry were allowed to witness the test flights. They were allowed to see the craft in action one night, though. Bob says the liftoff of the craft produced a corona glow and a hissing sound, but once the craft was a few feet off the ground, it hovered silently. Bob says the craft creates a heart-shaped gravitational distortion as it flies, which distorts even light around it, making the craft seem invisible if you stand beneath it. Despite this, Bob says that the personnel on the ground were able to communicate with the pilot via radio. Bob suspected that the radio waves should have also been distorted around the craft, making radio communication impossible, but he wasn't given the opportunity to study that particular aspect of the craft's operation.
That's partly because Bob didn't work at S4 for very long. He only worked there for about 6 months in total. And frankly, it doesn't sound like S4 had what you'd call a good workplace culture. Bob says rhythmic shouting and threats were used as a form of hypnosis. He also says that S4 was not a productive place for scientific research. The facility operated on the buddy system, so Bob was only allowed to share information and ideas with his lab partner, Barry. The effect of this, says Bob, is that the pace of advancement grinds to a halt because different groups working on different parts of the craft can't figure out how all the different systems work together. Eventually, Bob stopped getting called to go into S4. He also noticed that people from S4 began following him. He was fearful that he was about to be fired and might not be able to get a similar job, so he did what any of us would. Rounded up a few friends, packed into a Winnebago, and drove out to the desert to watch some test flights of extraterrestrial craft. Again, Bob knew the test flight schedule and took his friends out a few times to watch the crafts in action. On the third time watching these test flights, the group was pretty raucous. It was pitch dark out while they waited, and somebody made a crack about how they should storm Area 51 and Rudo run in there and take it over or something like that. Not long after, they saw a green light drop to the ground and roll toward them. Bob and his friends switched on some lights, only to find that they were surrounded by security personnel with night vision scopes, which is the thing that fell off and rolled toward them.
Bob was brought in for questioning by personnel at S4. During the questioning, Bob learned the real reason why he hadn't been called into work for a while. Well, he was suspected of having a unstable home life because his wife was having an affair. Strange as it may seem that this came up in this situation, Bob previously agreed to allow his home phones to be monitored by the government. Part of getting top security clearances is demonstrating your character and agreeing to be surveyed or surveilled by so that the government can look out for any warning signs. In this case, Bob being cucked by his wife's flight instructor made his superiors think he might be a security risk. Apparently, Mrs. Lazar didn't know a lot about Bob's employment and thought he was having an affair. So to get back at him, she started banging her flight instructor, hence making Bob a cuck.
Yeah.
To really rub salt in the wound, Bob's interrogators didn't just reveal he was being cucked. They even read transcript of his wife's conversations with her, what I can only assume is hogged out flight instructor buddy.
Right. You have to assume he was hogged out.
Yeah, I mean, he was a pilot.
Right.
At this point, Bob knew his time at S4 was over, but he wasn't sure for how much longer he would be cucked. Not knowing what exactly he should do, he felt compelled to tell the story of what he'd seen at the facility. He felt the information was too important to humanity to continue to be a secret, and that it was a crime the government was withholding these shocking revelations. Bob contacted the local CBS affiliate, KLAS TV, and told his story to reporter George Knapp. Initially, Bob gave an anonymous interview where his face was obscured and he used the pseudonym Dennis. After this interview aired, Bob said he got a call from his former supervisor at S4, also named Dennis, who asked Bob, quote, "Do you have any idea what we're going to do to you now?" and hung up the phone. After the phone call, Bob was subject of what he says is harassment by the U.S. government. Bob says he was followed everywhere, he had a tire shot out, and had some of his personal civilian records erased. Bob detailed these allegations in a follow-up interview with George Knapp, which aired a few months after the first interview.
In the time since then, Bob says that even his friends and family have been subject to harassment, like being audited by the IRS and having their own security clearances revoked. Despite this, Bob has tried to lead a normal life. Since 1987, Bob and his longtime friend and supporter, Gene Huff, have run Desert Blast, a festival for pyrotechnic enthusiasts. He also runs a company called United Nuclear Scientific Equipment and Supplies. Nevertheless, the government just won't leave him alone. In 2003, United Nuclear's offices were raided by police. Then in 2006, Bob was charged with violating the Federal Hazardous Substances Act for shipping restricted chemicals across state lines. United Nuclear was fined in 2007 for selling supplies to make illegal fireworks. In 2018, a documentary was released chronicling Bob's story. That documentary is on Netflix. It's called Bob Lazar, Area 51, and Flying Saucers. During the filming of the documentary, this was in 2016, United Nuclear's offices were again raided by police for the ostensible purpose of looking for receipts or sales records. Bob, however, believes that the government is looking for element 115, which Bob has long believed to have stolen from S4. The 2016 raid happened the day after Bob gave a supposed secret interview to the director of the documentary, Jeremy Kenyon Lockyer Corbell, possibly about Bob smuggling element 115 out of S4. According to Bob and Jeremy, the agents raiding United Nuclear were able to quote verbatim parts of the interview. Bob suspects that much of the harassment he suffered over the years is due to the suspicion that he lifted some 115 from S4. That said, in the interest of fairness, Bob himself has never actually said that he did in fact steal element 115.
Ultimately, Bob says he wishes he never went public with his experiences. He says he and his loved ones have suffered too much harassment to make it worthwhile, even though he does think it's important that the public know what the government is hiding at S4. And there you have it. In somewhat brief, that's Bob Lazar's story. But it's not really the end of the story about Bob Lazar. Bob has been a controversial figure pretty much from the beginning and has faced a lot of criticism from believers and skeptics alike. So let's take a look at some of Bob's claims and then discuss some of the evidence surrounding them. Let's start by looking at Bob's background. Bob claims to hold advanced degrees from both Caltech and MIT, which are pretty prestigious institutions here in the US, right? And in the world. It stands to reason that somebody with those kind of credentials would be able to land a gig at Los Alamos National Lab and at S4. That said, lots of people have questioned Bob's educational history. Even George Knapp, the original Bob Lazar promoter, could not find records of Bob attending either Caltech or MIT. George, however, did speak to friends of Bob's who attested to dropping him off at Caltech, presumably because Bob was enrolled there. Speaking at the Ultimate UFO Seminar in Rachel, Nevada in 1993, Bob attempted to clarify his education history. Bob says that he started out at Pierce Junior College in California in maybe 1976. Then in 77 or 78, took some classes at California State University, Northridge. Then went to MIT, earning a master's in 1982. He then got his master's from Caltech in 1985. Bob says the lack of records is part of the government's effort to erase him. One prominent person who didn't find this claim compelling is none other than Stanton T. Friedman, a nuclear physicist and eminent UFOologist, who is one of the central figures in the study of the Roswell UFO incident. Friedman says he checked with all 4 schools Bob claims to have attended. Only Pierce Junior College had any record of Bob Lazar's enrollment there, where he took electronics courses in the late 70s. According to Friedman, Bob was enrolled at Pierce the same time that he was supposed to be at MIT, which is a pretty daunting commute if you ask me, Andy.
That's rough. My arms are tired.
Talk about coast to coast.
AM.
Friedman also checked with Bob's high school and found that Bob graduated in August 1976 rather than in June with the rest of his class. Friedman believes this is because Bob had to take summer classes to get enough credits to graduate. According to Friedman, the only science class Bob took in high school was chemistry. When Bob did graduate, Friedman says Bob ranked 261 out of 369 students in his class.
Nice.
Which would not allow him to be admitted to either MIT or Caltech. Friedman also says earning a master's at MIT requires a thesis, and there's no record of a Bob Lazar thesis at MIT. In addition to all these discrepancies, Bob has also mentioned that one of his professors at Caltech was a guy named Bill Duxler. Stanton Friedman, who is the champion of proving Bob Lazar wrong, looked up. He's really on a crusade here. He is.
Yeah, definitely.
Looked up Bill Duxler, and it turns out he was a professor at Pierce Junior College and never taught at Caltech. In the Alamogordo Daily News story about Bob's jet-powered Honda, the article mentions that Bob and his wife, Carol, had been in Los Alamos for about a month, moving to California. In 1986, Bob filed for bankruptcy. In the bankruptcy filing, he only listed 2 addresses in the previous 6 years, and both were in Los Alamos. There's no record of Bob ever living in or around Cambridge, Massachusetts, where MIT is located.
So Bob's educational background is maybe a little bit suspect. Bob's job at Los Alamos, though, has also come under scrutiny. Bob has claimed for a long time that he worked at Los Alamos National Lab. George Knapp tried to verify those claims with the lab, but they had no record of Bob ever working there. What George did find, though, was a 1982 phone book for the lab, which clearly listed Robert Lazar. To those who believe in Bob's story, this is definitive proof that he actually did work for Los Alamos National Lab. According to Bob Lazar slayer Stanton Friedman, though, the phone book for the lab includes employees from an outside contractor, Kirk Meyer. Kirk Meyer would not have been hiring physicists into the lab, but would have been hiring electronic technicians, fabricators, data entry personnel, machinists, basically support staff for the physicists who were actually employed by the lab itself. Next to Bob's name in the phone book is a K/M designation, allegedly, which would signify that he worked for Kirk Meyer and not for Los Alamos National Lab proper. Despite all that, Bob still told the Jet Car reporter that he was a physicist at the lab.
So if anything, Bob's career after Los Alamos is even more hotly contested, if you can believe it. Obviously, Bob claims he was living in Las Vegas and wanted to get back into a kind of science job. He wanted to rejoin the science community and fired around a bunch of resumes, including one to Ed Teller, who then helped him get employed at S4. That part, it might be true, but, there are some skeptics. In 1985, Bob and his wife allegedly bought a legal brothel in Nevada. Stanton Friedman doesn't believe Bob could have gotten the required clearance to work at S4 having operated a brothel. Scientist and blogger Tom Mahood questions how Bob could have gotten security clearance after having filed bankruptcy in 1986. Mahood is even skeptical that there is a facility at all at S4, having been in the mountains near the restricted area and never having sighted the hangar doors alleged by Bob. If we assume, though, that Bob was somehow able to get security clearance and, secure a job at a facility near Groom Lake, the home of Area 51. What about the extraterrestrial craft Bob claims to have worked on? Well, according to Mahood, one of the things actually going on at Groom Lake was that the government was running some kind of particle accelerator to shoot particle beams into the atmosphere. Apparently, if you fire a high-energy proton beam into the atmosphere, it creates a glowing ball of plasma in the sky. Mahood believes that Bob knew about the particle beam machine and that Bob may have even worked on it. Through this experience, Bob would have known when the facility fired the particle beam, which would have allowed him to bring his friends to show them the quote-unquote so-called UFOs. Because this activity is still classified, Bob's story cannot be definitively disproved.
Now, Bunk Funkers, I'm no egghead scientist, but let's talk a little bit about the science behind Bob Lazar's claims. Obviously, Bob has claimed a lot of technical things about the craft he worked on. Do these claims hold up? As we mentioned already, Bob describes the craft as creating a distortion in spacetime, which the craft then uses to bring the destination to itself rather than moving through space. Kind of like the Planet Express ship in Futurama. To scientists, though, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Basically, everything distorts spacetime. That's just how gravity works. We're all distorting spacetime right now. What physicists think Bob is describing is a wormhole, which is a theoretical concept, but one that's not entirely new. We've probably all heard the term at one point. Based on our understanding, in order to create a wormhole big enough and durable enough to allow the craft to move through, you'd need a whole lot of energy. Maybe like if all the matter in the Earth was converted to energy. Essentially, physicists don't find it compelling that there could have been enough fuel at S4 to operate the craft as described by Bob, especially not the relatively small amounts of fuel Bob said were on hand. Not to mention, if the craft creates a wormhole and creates this gravitational field to travel, surely this would have an impact on the surrounding area and probably the whole Earth. Mainstream physicists like Dr. David Morgan believe that if the craft Bob described operated in the way he described, the craft would draw everything in the nearby universe to it, including us all, Bunk Funkers! Bob's claims regarding the power source of the craft have also earned him critics. Bob has maintained that the crafts at S4 operated on element 115. It's the stuff that generates the gravity waves and also powers the craft. He says the way it worked is that once element 115 was placed in the reactor and the dome of the reactor was in place, the reactor just began working. No wiring, no switches, no nothing. It just goes when everything's in place. He says the way the reactor generates energy is by smashing a proton into the element 115, making element 116, which immediately decays, but also knocks loose an antiproton, the proton's antimatter cousin. Antimatter is just like regular matter, but with the opposite charge. Think of it as matter's evil twin with a sinister mustache. So this antiproton would have a negative charge. Now here's what egghead physicists say about this. Antimatter doesn't just live in the nucleus of other matter waiting to be bumped out by a reckless proton. The way to create antimatter is by converting energy to get a proton-antiproton pair. The amount of energy this takes is the same amount of energy you get out. You basically have to have a proton-antiproton pair already, then you smash them together to get a new proton-antiproton pair. Essentially, if the craft used antimatter for its power, it would create net energy of 0. I ain't no egghead, but I sure do know that 0 horsepower ain't getting you anywhere. All right? Get her done. Element 115 itself is an element so named because the number of protons in the nucleus of a 115 atom. A frequent claim is that the element 115 was completely unknown before Bob went public, but this really isn't true. The heaviest element we find in nature is uranium, number 92 on the periodic table. But even in the 1960s, it was theorized that heavier elements could be created. In fact, it was sometimes thought that despite heavier elements being typically unstable, that there would be an island of stability somewhere around 114 protons. Even in 1989, just 2 weeks before Bob went public with his story, Scientific American ran a piece on the possibilities of creating stable heavier elements, again, around 114. To be fair to Bob, element 115 is no longer just an idea, it actually exists. It was first synthesized in 2003 and now has the name moscovium. The only way we know how to produce moscovium is in a particle accelerator, by smashing calcium ions into a americium. Further, moscovium is pretty unstable with a dang fast half-life. The most stable isotope of the element known today, moscovium-290, has a half-life of 0.65 seconds. Bob claims that there were hundreds of pounds of element 115 at S4, but based on what we know, it's not really possible to accumulate an appreciable amount of moscovium. Bob, however, maintains that element 115 at S4 is likely an isotope we haven't been able to recreate here on Earth. I think most chemists, though, would probably say that there's no evidence that any of the elements near the atomic weight of moscovium are significantly more stable. But again, I'm not an egghead chemist. I'm also not an egghead astronomer, but here we go. Bob has said that element 115 is possibly plentiful in the star system where the extraterrestrials originate. Again, that's Zeta Reticuli. Since it's a binary star system, Bob's hypothesis is that perhaps the binary star system has produced worlds where element 115 is abundant, and the ETs essentially grew up working with 115, so maybe their development track is just different because of that. This idea, however, is not consistent with what astronomers say happens in stars. Stars produce heavier elements through fusion. Earth's sun fuses hydrogen atoms, that is, smashes them together in its hot tummy, to make helium, which releases the radiant energy we enjoy today. More massive stars can produce heavier elements by fusing different atoms together, all of this producing energy. Through fusion, stars can only produce elements as heavy as iron and nickel, 26 and 28 respectively on the periodic table. To make heavier elements, stars need to add energy. The only way this happens is through a supernova, the explosion of a star. As far as we know, all elements heavier than nickel and iron have been created by supernovae, shooting their big fat loads of heavy elements all across the universe. It stands to reason, then, that heavy elements should be fairly evenly distributed throughout the universe, regardless of the type of star system. Astronomers also indicate that a binary star system would not necessarily produce heavier elements. In the case of Zeta Reticuli, it's just two regular stars orbiting the same point.
Now, Andy, you may not be an egghead, but you're also not a good judge of character.
That's true.
All right, but we're going to try and right that ship today by looking at Bob Lazar's character. Like, who he is as a person, right? Now, Bunk Funkers, this might seem irrelevant, but, you know, Andy and I, we're trying to get you the whole enchilada on Bob Lazar, and that enchilada includes some tasty, creamy filling on his life and times.
So creamy.
It gets creamy. Bob married his first wife, Carol, on July 27th, 1980. As we've discussed already, they apparently moved to Los Alamos in 1982, where Bob says he gained employment with Los Alamos National Laboratory. We've mentioned Bob's bankruptcy already, but it's worth mentioning that in the bankruptcy filing, which was in 1986, Bob never listed employment with Los Alamos or Kirk Mayer, the Los Alamos contractor. The filing also doesn't mention the brothel, the Honeysuckle Ranch, by the way, that Bob and Carol allegedly purchased in Nevada in 1985. The only employment the bankruptcy file lists is as self-employed photo processors, which does appear to be an actual business that the Lazars operated. In 1985, the Lazars bought a home in Nevada where, according to the bankruptcy filing, Carol lived primarily while Bob stayed in Los Alamos. Possibly they were both running photo processing businesses in separate cities, I don't know. On April 19th, 1986, Bob married his second wife, Tracy. He was still married to Carol at the time. Then, 2 days later, on April 21st, 1986, Carol committed suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning from auto exhaust. Also in April 1986, Bob moved into the house in Las Vegas where Carol lived. He filed bankruptcy in July of 86. A lot of weird shit went on in 1986.
Quite a year for Bob Lazar.
Yeah. On October 12th, 1986, Bob and Tracy married again for some reason. Only this time, Tracy gave her name as Jackie. The marriage certificate was sent to the house where Carol had lived and died, indicating that Bob and Tracy/Jackie were now living there. Oh boy. It didn't last long though, because in March of 88, the bank threatened to foreclose because payments were not being made. Tracy/Jackie bought a new home and Bob deeded all of his interest to her. The house where Carol died was sold at auction. Bob separated from Tracy/Jackie in May 1989. The same month, his first interviews with George Knapp were broadcast. In June 1990, Bob was arrested and eventually pled guilty to a felony charge for pandering. The arrest stemmed from Bob visiting a prostitute. Bob and the prostitute, whose name was Tony Bullock, must have hit it off because Bob sent her to set up a solicitation business. Bob kept records of customers and took at least a 50% share of Tony's fees. He was a pimp. An administrative pimp. Bob also tried to get other women to participate. Ultimately, Bob got 6 months probation, 150 hours of community service, and was ordered to undergo psychotherapy. The judge told him he also had to stay away from brothels. Of course, there's also the matter of Bob's other legal troubles. While he feels he's being targeted unfairly by the government, United Nuclear does seem to have some pretty wild stuff on its website. Bob is a pyrotechnic enthusiast, so it's not that surprising that he probably is involved in the making and selling of illegal fireworks, or even in the sale of dangerous chemicals. In fact, the raid in 2016 during the filming of the documentary was conducted to look for evidence related to a murder committed in Michigan. Allegedly, the victim died of thallium poisoning, which may have been obtained from United Nuclear. Thallium is a colorless, odorless, tasteless, and highly toxic substance that's tricky to detect. Bob gave an interview where he said United Nuclear did not typically carry thallium, but that in 2007, a element collector, that is to say, a person who collects every element on the periodic table, well, they died and left his collection to his sister, who then asked Bob to sell it on his site. And even though Bob and Jeremy Corbell think that the raid was in response to the secret interview during the documentary shooting, police had already obtained search warrants the day before the interview. Law enforcement continues to maintain that the only reason the FBI was involved at all is because local law enforcement was not equipped to properly handle thallium. One additional thing. On the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, Bob claims that he's made no money off his status as a UFO pseudo-celebrity, reinforcing that he only tells his story because he believes it's the right thing to do. He claims any money made from the Netflix documentary is donated to local science education programs. Hey, that's a noble gesture if true, right?
Very true, yeah.
Aside from this, though, Bob recently wrote a book. He's undoubtedly made paid appearances at conventions and the like. He does sell UFO and Area 51 merch on his website, and he worked with test stores models to make a model of the craft at S4. Allegedly, Bob got a percentage of all those sales.
Now, aside from all this, another popular piece of Bob Lazar lore is the hand scanner Bob has described at S4. Bob said there were scanners where you place your palm on the surface and the machine uses a bright light to measure the bones in your fingers. Lazar believers, or Bob believers, as I call them, claim that such a device was unheard of before Bob brought it to light. The device Bob described, however, was seen in the 1977 E.T. film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The scanners also had some commercial applications and were in use at government facilities and even in some early ATMs. I also think it's worth mentioning that after Bob left S4 and started talking to George Knapp, he had trouble remembering all the details. Bob voluntarily underwent hypnosis to help him remember his time at S4. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong with hypnosis. Art and I are both big fans of famous hypnotist Evan Essence of Life. But is it possible that Bob's memories were somehow changed by hypnosis? Or maybe that he used hypnosis as a way to believe something about his life that didn't actually happen? I raise this question because George Knapp put Bob through a series of no fewer than 4 polygraph tests, with a polygraph expert weighing in on the results. Bob was found to be not deceptive. Is it really possible that Bob Lazar is telling the whole truth about everything in his story?
Crack open an egg. Watch the yolk and the white spill out. What the fuck is even the point of this shell? Visit a local music shop and buy a trumpet. Yell into the trumpet everything you feel and see what happens on the other side. Are we really just hamsters in this rat race of life? Is there any way to get from Lincoln, Nebraska to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania without taking a right turn? These are the things that haunt me at night. Every time I sit on the toilet, I start to cry. Shave your best friend completely and you tell me if you still like him after that.